In today's lecture, we'll talk about ferns. With regard to ferns, we will start by talking about new traits in the ferns that are not present in the lycophytes. The big new trait is that ferns have large leaves and branched veins. With regard to the leaves unroll as they open. That is different than most other plants. We will also review some traits of ferns that are similar to the lycophytes. These include that ferns are vascular plants, living ferns are herbaceous, ferns have sporangia, or structures to make spores, on the underside of their leaves in most cases. We will go over the life cycle of ferns again to refresh your memory, and we will talk about some different forms of ferns and some problem ferns that are invasive, as well as the fact that ferns are very good for the garden. Let's quickly review some of the different plant groups that we are discussing this semester. We had the charophyte algae that gave rise to terrestrial plants. We had three different kinds of bryophytes, the liverworts, mosses, and hornworts. And these were plants without vasculature, and these were plants that had a dominant gametophyte generation. Next, we talked about the lycophytes, also called the lycopods. We said that these were vascular plants that have a dominant sporophyte generation. We also said that the lycophytes have vasculature. We're now up to the ferns, which are pretty similar to the lycophytes. Both these groups are not seed plants. They have a free-living gametophyte generation. After the ferns, the other two groups we will have left to talk about are the gymnosperms and angiosperms, which are both seed plants. And if we look at that same information on a phylogeny, we can see that the ferns are out here. So on the tree of all terrestrial plants, we had the charophytes that gave rise to them, the three kinds of bryophytes. The lycophytes branched off next, leaving all of the vascular plants on this, or all of the other vascular plants on this branch. Then we have three groups that all have large leaves, and out of those, the ferns branch off first, and the seed plants are the other group. As I said in the outline, the big new trait of ferns compared to lycophytes is that ferns have large leaves with branching vasculature within the leaves. If we look at a lycophyte, this is a diagram of what it would look like. Here's the stem, basically a cylinder, and there would be a strand of vasculature running through it. Wherever there was a leaf, there would be a strand of vasculature that would come off and enter the leaf, but within the leaf there's no further branching, so there's only one strand. It never divides into multiple. The result of this is that for the leaf tissue to be near the vascular tissue, it can't be very large. It can't grow out to this area, for example. That's partly because the vascular bundle provides structural support, and it's partly because the cells that are too far away wouldn't be able to get water and nutrients from the vasculature, and they would not be able to send effectively their photosynthetic products back to the vasculature. So lycophytes had small leaves. This could be one of the things that made them never get very diverse. Now if we look at the ferns, we see a similar schematic. Again, here's the stem with the central vasculature. But now where the vasculature branches off into the leaf, it's not just one strand. That strand divides at various places into substrands. And schematically I didn't draw many, but these substrands would further subdivide into finer and finer layers of vasculature. This is going to give additional structural support, but more importantly, it's going to allow leaf tissue that is far from that central vein to still be able to send its photosynthetic products back to the vasculature such that its sugar, for example, can then be sent to other parts of the plant. Generally speaking, plants with broad leaves have more opportunities to catch sunlight than plants with small leaves. This could have been one of the reasons that ferns, as well as other plants with large leaves, gymnosperms and angiosperms, were able to outcompete lycophytes. So back in the Carboniferous period, lycophytes were the dominant tree. Large tree-sized ferns were around then too, but over time the large tree-like lycophytes went extinct, and that could be because they were less effective in catching sunlight. So we just addressed the big difference between ferns and lycophytes, but there are a whole lot of similarities. As we've already mentioned, both ferns and lycophytes are vascular plants. Both ferns and lycophytes also have a dominant sporophyte. Remember, a sporophyte is always diploid. So they have a dominant sporophyte or diploid generation. And this is important to remind you because diploid cells always have a backup copy of each chromosome. So if one of them gets damaged, the other one is still around to make the gene products that are necessary. This would not have been true in the bryophytes. Like the lycophytes, the ferns have a thick cuticle, so they're able to grow both up above the soil surface. They're also able to grow in drier areas, and the cuticle helps them to conserve water. Like the lycophytes, ferns have stomata on photosynthetic tissue, so on their leaves, and this is going to allow the ferns to balance gas exchange for photosynthesis with the need to prevent water loss when it gets too dry. In other words, when the plants have plenty of water and conditions are good for photosynthesis, the leaves can open their stomata and allow gas exchange to occur. But if conditions get bad for photosynthesis, say it becomes nighttime and there's no sunlight, or if conditions become too dry, then the plants can close their stomata, and this will prevent water loss and allow the plants to conserve. Remember that the lycophytes had true roots, true stems, and true leaves. That was the first group to have these structures. This is also true of the ferns. And remember that when we say true roots, stems, and leaves, what we're saying is that there are three different kinds of cell tissues. There's epidermal tissue, there's ground tissue, notably parenchyma, and there's also vascular tissue. So most of the traits then are similar between ferns and lycophytes. Ferns, like the living lycophytes, are all herbs or herbaceous. This means that they do not have any true wood. Now, what I'm about to say will sound paradoxical, but despite this, there are ferns, even ones that are alive today, that are both large and look like trees. And here's a picture of a small herbaceous fern that looks nothing like a tree. This is a Botrychium, or a grape fern, and it's probably growing somewhere around 6 inches tall. So a small plant you would not confuse for a tree. But over here is what we would call a tree fern, and this particular one happens to be from South Africa, but this could be growing several meters tall. It's got a thick trunk, it looks like a tree. When we say that there's no true wood, what we mean is that the xylem is not expanding outward by a vascular cambium, so the center of this is not many different rings of xylem, as it would be in true wood, like we've talked about before. So tree ferns do exist, but most fern species are small and more like the Botrychium than like the tree fern here. Most are near the ground or maybe up to a meter or so tall. We use a special word for fern leaves. We call them fronds. And we call them fronds as opposed to normal leaves because they often have a form that looks different. Specifically, they are frequently divided, like in this picture of a sensitive fern on the left, such that the one leaf blade, and I'm going to move my mouse around the outside of the leaf blade, this is all one leaf and one blade on the leaf. But it is divided much like a compound leaf into subsections. On the sensitive fern on the left here, there's only one layer of division into subsections. But over here on the right, we have a different fern called a bracken fern. And again, what we see here is one leaf, and everything here is one blade. In this case, there are many levels of division. So this leaf is divided into subsections like this, where I'm moving my mouse now, but then each of those subsections is divided into its own subsections that go this way or this way, for example. And each of those subsections is further divided into smaller subsections. So we could say this leaf on the right has at least 3 different levels of subsections. And we'll call those subsections of a fern leaf pinnae. An unusual characteristic of fern leaves is that they unroll as they open. Most leaves don't do this. You've seen tree leaves open, for example, in the springtime, but you've never seen them unwind. In contrast, for a fern leaf, it starts off rolled up in a spiral, and as it matures, then it literally unwinds itself and straightens out until it's a fully open leaf. These spirals that the leaf makes look like the head of a fiddle, or a fiddle's another name for a violin. So if you look over here, you see the spiral at the head of a fiddle, and hence this structure here is called a fiddlehead. To break away from classic botany for a minute, I will mention that fiddleheads are springtime delicacies. These are really quite delicious. They are hard to find in the supermarket, but if you go to probably an upper end supermarket in the springtime, you can often find them for sale. Not all ferns are edible, but many species are. Many of them are going to require cooking to get rid of some toxins that will break down as they cook. And so I don't suggest just going out into the woods and picking any fiddleheads that you find. If you do some reading and learn to identify ferns, you might be able to go pick your own. If you do pick your own, then it's important not to pick all of the fiddleheads you find because you wouldn't want to kill the plant. Ferns are perennial, they'll come back year after year, but if you pick all of the fiddleheads, you can set the plant back too much and possibly kill it or at least make it less healthy. So preferably going to the supermarket is a good option, and just make sure that you read cooking instructions and cook them appropriately. If you do, I think you'll find them to be a special treat. This is one serving suggestion. We've talked about fern leaves. Let's move to the stems. Ferns do have stems, but if you just walk around and look at the above ground parts of a fern, you wouldn't always realize this. This is because oftentimes the stems are below ground. Additionally, even when the stem is above ground, oftentimes it doesn't elongate very much. It has very short internodes, is a fancier way of saying that. So it appears like the leaves are all coming off of the same spot. This is the basal rosette form that we talked about earlier in the semester. However, ferns often have underground stems, and oftentimes these are rhizomes. So this is another reminder from earlier in the semester that rhizomes in fact are a kind of stem. Remember that rhizomes are underground stems that are used partly for storage, but they also allow a plant to spread. So this fern might, for example, send out a rhizome, and then a new rosette of leaves might form over here. To continue on that idea that many ferns spread by rhizomes, I'll first remind you that all ferns are herbs. None of them make true wood, and we've talked about that already, even though many are tree-like. As we said, when they spread by rhizomes, this is what it would look like below ground. This horizontal root-like portion is not actually a root. This is the rhizome, and then these little parts coming off of it are roots. And you can see that at various points along the rhizome, there are vertical stems that come up and new leaves come off of it. So if we were walking around and just looking at the above ground parts, let's imagine soil was right here, we would just see several independent leaves coming off, and it would be hard to know if they were connected to each other or not. In other cases, it's a lot easier to see. There are some species of ferns that climb. For example, they might climb up rocky surfaces or the trunks of trees. And in this case, they make aerial rhizomes, or rhizomes that are exposed to the air. You can see what those look like here. In this case, we can use aerial rhizomes as an interesting feature in our gardens. So this is just a pot of ferns, and the aerial rhizomes are growing down the side of the pot. You can see too that at intervals along these rhizomes, leaves are coming off. So even though these look kind of like hairy roots, you know it's not, because a leaf would never grow out of a root at intervals like this. Ferns can occur in a variety of habitats, but they are most often found in damp, cool habitats. And oftentimes damp, cool habitats are underneath the cover of other trees. This means that most ferns can tolerate growing under low light levels. And indeed, many ferns wouldn't do well if you put them out in full sun. They are not adapted to those conditions, and it could harm them. So if you want to go find ferns in nature, you would want to go find an area that is low-lying, preferably that has moist soils, and probably that has a fairly full, if not complete, canopy above it. Remember that ferns have swimming sperm, and this is important because it means that at least some point during the season, there has to be some standing water on the soil surface in order for the sperm that get made from one gametophyte to swim and fertilize the egg on a neighboring gametophyte. There can be asexual reproduction, so remember ferns can spread by rhizomes. That means they don't always require sexual reproduction, but eventually sexual reproduction will be necessary, so those conditions will be needed. And this is a picture of ostrich ferns, which can be found in the southeast. It's a fairly large fern. It can grow a few feet tall. While ferns most often occur in damp, shady conditions, they are capable of growing in a variety of other conditions. So one such condition is floating on the surface of especially fresh water. And this can be nice, but it can also be a huge inconvenience for humans, both because they can change the ecology of the ponds or lakes that they're floating on, but also because it can preclude activities like swimming or fishing or boating, and so it can have negative economic effects. This pictured here is a fern called giant salvinia, and it's a floating fern. This is an introduced one, and it can take over and choke up water surfaces. Something kind of cool about it, it doesn't actually have any true roots. It's lost the ability to make roots. Instead, what it does is it makes specialized leaves that don't have photosynthetic blades they instead focus on having just vascular tissue, and that vascular tissue then hangs down into the water and functions like roots to perform nutrient exchange with the water itself. And what we see on these ferns, you can probably make out some white hairs on their surface. Those are trichomes that are one of the most distinctive features. Another unusual habitat or form for ferns is climbing ferns. And so this is another invasive plant that occurs in the southeast. It occurs in South Carolina, but is more of a problem in Florida. And this picture on the right shows a close-up of some of the leaves. You can see some different forms. This form is less divided, this form is more divided. That has to do with some of these leaves being reproductive and other ones not being. So this picture on the left shows what it looks like on a habitat scale. And this picture looks almost like kudzu. You can see that the fern has completely covered everything in the foreground and even climbed up into these trees in the background. So this is Japanese climbing fern. It was introduced from Asia into North America, and it's got a really interesting form because it climbs with its leaves. So these aren't stems that climb up the trees. Instead, it will be individual leaves that just make a really long central midrib with leaflets coming off of it. And that is what causes the climbing. So it's a very unusual leaf form. You can see that this is growing in bright areas, which is necessary if it's going to climb over the tops of trees. It will still be growing in moist areas, so it'll be getting all of the water it needs from being in a swampy or wet area. I'm going to mention one group of weird ferns that get a lot of attention. Historically, we didn't think that these were ferns. We thought they were their own group. But we now have a lot of molecular evidence as well as other evidence that tells us, in fact, this is just an ancient and strange group of ferns. So what's pictured here are two different kinds of horsetails, also called equisetum. And you can see sometimes they make these leaf-like side appendages, but the ones that we more commonly see only have these tiny leaf-like appendages, and otherwise the photosynthetic part of the plant is the stem itself. So even over here, these things that look like leaves are really going to be stem tissue, not true leaf tissue. We call the ones on the right here horsetails, because if you flipped it upside down and ignored the fact that it was green, it would look more or less like a horsetail. We call the ones on the left here scouring rush. The reason for this is that these plants are embedded with fine silica granules. Remember that silica is what gives most sandpaper its coarse texture. So traditionally, people would have gathered these and then used them as scrub brushes to do things like sand or to clean dishes. The horsetails that we have now are typically on the small side. They're herbaceous like other ferns, and the ones that we would typically find might be 6 inches to a couple feet tall. However, like the lycophytes, back in ancient times they were much larger. So in the Carboniferous period, when we had lycophyte trees, we also had horsetail trees, and these trees could be 100 feet tall. So that's as tall as the tallest trees you're used to seeing in the southeast of the United States today. Those, like the lycophyte trees, have gone extinct, leaving us only the smaller herbaceous horsetails today. We've been focusing mostly on the strict botany of ferns, but I wanted to mention that ferns are great garden plants. They're especially good if you have shady areas in a yard and you want some foliage. They are able to grow in, at least many species can grow in shady areas, as long as the soil has adequate organic matter that they can stay moist. And I haven't formally researched this, but they are reputed to be resistant to deer browsing. So if you have deer coming through your yard and can't grow other things, this could be a good choice. Additionally, because ferns are rhizomatic, they can spread through their rhizomes. So if you plant a few and the conditions are good, they can fill in that space. There are ferns that can grow under full light. There are larger ones and there are smaller ones. So you can find a fern to occupy just about any space in your garden. This fern pictured here is called maidenhair fern, and there are maidenhair ferns that are native to eastern North America. Because at least some ferns do become invasive, I would strongly encourage you, if you do plant ferns, to go online and check and make sure that the species you're planting is native to the area you live in, rather than buying Asian ferns and planting them here and risking that they will then spread and take over natural areas. We've talked about fern reproduction earlier in the semester when we talked about life cycles. But because that was a while ago, and because life cycles are hard, I'm going to talk some more about fern reproduction now. First, a reminder that the ferns that we see if we're just walking around not looking very closely, everything we see is a sporophyte. Remember, as we said earlier in this lecture, sporophytes are always diploid. They have 2 copies of chromosomes in each cell. So that diploid sporophyte is going to have leaves, as pictured here, and typically on the underside of the leaves, if the plant is reproductive, there's going to be groups of sporangia. So you can see several circles on this pinnae here, as well as all of the other pinnae pictured. If we look at one of those pinnae close up, this is the sort of structure we would see. There's many of these little balls. There's probably more than 100 in this picture, and each one of these little balls is actually a sporangia. So inside that sporangia, it's going to make spores. And one of these groups of sporangia is called a sorus. If the plural of sorus, like many words that have this ending, is going to switch to I. So if we're referring to many of them, we'll talk about sori. If we're talking about one, we'll talk about a sorus. In some species of ferns, but not others, there's a protective cover over the top of the sorus. And so you would just see a flap of tissue here, and you would have to peel it away to see the sporangia underneath. In this case, that's not present. So as I promised, we're going to go over the life cycle again. And when we do that, let's start with our sporophyte. If you were walking around in the woods, the chances are this is what you would see. But remember, on the underside of these leaves, there are going to be sori, and the sori are composed of sporangia, and those sporangia will make spores. Spores, remember, are haploid. They are 1N. That means that if we're going from diploid to haploid, the only process that can do that is the process of meiosis. If you go back to your life cycle lecture, look at your notes and remind yourself that meiosis is the reduction division. So we go from the sporophyte here to the spores by meiosis. We now have haploid spores that are each 1 cell big. We need to grow multicellular gametophytes out of those. And the process that we are going to use is mitosis. Remember, mitosis makes exact copies. So if the spores here are haploid, then that means if we make exact copies of those cells, we end up with a multicellular structure, but the multicellular structure is still haploid. And the name for the haploid generation is the gametophyte. So by mitosis, we get a female gametophyte if it was a spore destined to become female. We get a male gametophyte if it was a spore that developed into a male. These are both multicellular haploid individuals. Now, not a big surprise, the male gametophyte is going to make male gametes, which are sperm. Remember that sperm, just like in animals, are haploid. So we have haploid gametophytes making haploid gametes. Well, the only process that can do that is one that makes identical copies of the cell. We cannot have a reduction division going from a gametophyte to a gamete because the gametophyte is already reduced to the 1N or haploid state. So the only thing it can do is mitosis. So I wrote mitosis down here, but we could equally write it right here. So mitosis is going to give us male sperm. These would have tails, but they would be very small and hard to see. On the female gametophyte, we are going to have cells that by, again, the process of mitosis, are going to give us eggs. And the eggs are the female gametes, just as the sperm are the male gametes. Because the eggs were made by mitosis, they are genetically identical to the female gametophyte. Now, in order for the eggs to do something, they have to be fertilized. The eggs are going to stay with the female gametophyte, but the sperm have tails and they can swim. So long as these two gametophytes are close to each other, the sperm can swim over, swim through a small opening, and fertilize the egg. Once we get a fertilized egg, then it becomes a zygote. The zygote isn't pictured here, but you can just imagine this egg now being a zygote. It now needs to make a sporophyte. Well, remember, if fertilization has happened, then we've gone from the haploid state, 1N, to the diploid state, 2N. So we now have a diploid zygote. It needs to develop into first an immature and then later a mature sporophyte. In order to make a mature sporophyte, the only process that can happen is mitosis, because mitosis makes exact copies. So we can't have meiosis here, because meiosis would take us back from the diploid to the haploid state. Instead, this process has to be mitosis. So we get mitosis first forming this young plant, further mitosis forms the mature plant, and then we can get sporangia forming, and those sporangia can again go through meiosis and make our next generation of spores. Remember that in this process, we have a multicellular sporophyte, and that is one of our generations. We have a multicellular gametophyte, and that is our other generation. And so we have two different generations. As a result, this entire life cycle is called alternation of generations. This life cycle is essentially the same as it is for the lycophytes, with only esoteric differences. I will end with some final thoughts about the ferns. First, despite their similarities to the lycophytes, there are nearly 10 times as many fern species as lycophytes. There are about 10,000 fern species, slightly more, and there's only slightly more than 1,000 lycophyte species. So that says that even though they're pretty similar, the ferns have figured out something that has let them be more successful than the lycophytes. Second, there's a diversity of fern forms and habitat requirements. So we could all draw a cartoon of a generic fern, but there's a variety of different forms, like the aquatic fern I showed you and the climbing fern I showed you. And while most ferns prefer moist, shaded environments, there are ones that will grow under very dry environments, there are ones that will grow in full sunlight, and of course there are ones that will float on water bodies. As we talked about, ferns have a lot of potential for garden plants, especially if you want to fill some space with lush foliage. And if you do this, again, please check, just Google the name of the state you live in and native ferns, and you should be able to find a list of ferns that naturally occur in the area, some of which you'll be able to find at garden stores. It's preferable to avoid ones from elsewhere. And to help us transition to the next group we'll talk about, the gymnosperms, remember that the ferns are the last group we are going to talk about with a free-living gametophyte. You are probably growing ferns right now in your fern dish, and you might be finding some green, small structures in the petri dish. Those are your gametophytes, remember. So that is a separate generation you can see. As your ferns continue to grow, we're going to be watching next for the formation of sporophytes.